So, last time we were talking about devotion, but devotion means that we are devotion to something, we are devoted to something. What is that? We are devoted to a goal. It's a goal orientation. Now, if you want to pass some examination or something, you are devoted to your studies because you want to attain that goal. The goal is that what you want to attain. Now, last time we said that the goal of the human being is to reach that state of perfection, and that is represented by the Buddha. So when we are thinking of the goal, or in other theistic religions, the goal is God, because all religions are ultimately trying to unite with God. So God becomes the goal. And for the Buddhist, the God is the Buddha, because that God is the humanistic God. I said Brahma Bhuto. Brahma means God. Bhuto means become, God become. So when we speak of the Buddha, we are speaking of the human being becoming God. That is the humanistic religion. So that means the Buddha becomes the goal. So the goal that we are trying to reach is the Buddha. Buddha represents that goal. And we believe that it is possible for a human being to reach that state of perfection. Now, from the Christian point of view, the human being is a sinner. And the human being can never become God. Even when they talk about uniting with God, it only means that the human being can go to heaven and be in front of God. God is still separate from the human being. So that is the theistic way of thinking. But in this humanistic way of thinking, which is Buddhism, the human being can become God. That is the most important thing to understand. And so, the practice of religion is to gradually approach towards that goal by perfecting yourself. And the first step in that process of becoming perfect is, of course, being devoted to the Buddha, the worship of the Buddha. We don't pray to the Buddha. This is very important to understand. Buddhists don't pray to anyone. Prayer means asking for help. We are not asking for help. We worship the Buddha, which means we recognize the worth of what the Buddha achieved. That is worshipping the Buddha. Worship means worship. So that we are recognizing the worth of the Buddha. So when we talk about the Buddha, we are not just talking about the body of the Buddha. The important thing is the mind of the Buddha. Now, the Christians speak of Jesus as God become man. God has become man. Christ is supposed to be the Son of God, and so he must be God. But this God has become man, and therefore Jesus sometimes gets angry and sometimes weeps. All that is explained as the human nature of Jesus, because God has become man. But when we speak of the Buddha, we are talking about man becoming God. It's the other way around. Man becomes God. And when man has become God, that God never gets angry. The Buddha, we don't speak of the Buddha as becoming angry. And the Buddha never weeps. He is never unhappy. The Buddha is always happy. So you see the difference. We are thinking of a man become God, and we also believe that it is possible for the human being to become God. That means God is one who is perfect in knowledge and perfect in goodness. You see, perfect in knowledge and perfect in goodness. This is what we say when we say Vidya Charana Sampanno. Vidya means knowledge. Charana is the behavior, the goodness of the behavior. Vidya Charana Sampanno. Sugato. Su means good. Gato means arrive at goodness. In other words, become good. Su gato, become good. By purifying the mind. Become good. Now the important thing is that we are devoted to the Buddha means we are devoted to that goal. Buddha becomes our goal. So that is why even though the Buddha is not living today, at least we have a statue to look at the Buddha. And that statue represents the Buddha. After all, even the body of the Buddha was not the real Buddha. It's the mind of the Buddha. And the mind of the Buddha is represented by the body of the Buddha when he was living. But now, instead of the body of the Buddha, we have the statue to represent still the mind of the Buddha. So when we are looking at the statue, the important thing is not that statue, but the mind of the Buddha, which cannot be seen. The mind of the Buddha can only be understood. You can't see the Buddha. This is why the Buddha always said, there was a disciple of the Buddha during the time of the Buddha who was always seated in a place where he could see the Buddha and always sitting near the Buddha and looking at the Buddha. So the Buddha said, why are you looking at this filthy body of mine? If you want to see me, you have to see the Dhamma. He who sees the Dhamma sees me. He who sees the body doesn't really see me. And that is the important thing to understand. That when we think of the Buddha, we are thinking of the mind, but you can't see the mind. You see the mind only through the Dhamma. So when you have understood the Dhamma, you begin to see the mind of the Buddha. So that is very important to understand. And so our devotion to the Buddha is the devotion to the mind of the Buddha. And we will be able to see the mind directly. How? Only when we become a Buddha ourselves. Only when we have become a Buddha ourselves, then we really see the Buddha. Just looking at the body is not looking at the Buddha. So it is very important to reach that state of mind ourselves. Only then we see the Buddha in the real way. So this is very important to understand that devotion means being devoted to the mind of the Buddha, and that becomes the goal that we have to reach. So really seeing the Buddha is to become the Buddha. And that is why the starting point in becoming the Buddha is what is called Sila. Sila is that behavior. Now I told you last time that we are organisms in an environment. Organism is like a machine. And this machine is different from these other machines because we have 5 senses. These other machines don't have these 5 senses. Even the computer is a very highly developed machine, but it doesn't have the 5 senses. Now the environment stimulates the senses. Light falling on the eye, sounds coming to the ears, smells coming to the nose, taste coming to the tongue, and touch coming to the body. In this way, the environment stimulates the organism, and this organism reacts to the stimulus. And the reaction of the organism to the stimulus is perception, or seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. So the organism reacts to the stimulus, and that reaction is what we call perception. Vijnana, and that is today translated as consciousness, which is wrong. Vijnana is not consciousness, Vijnana is perception. But once perception has taken place, the information that you get through that process of perception is carried to the brain through the nerves. Every sense organ has a nerve going to the brain, like the optic nerve, auditory nerve, olfactory nerve, like that. All these nerves go to the brain, and the nerve is like a telephone wire that carries messages to the brain, and once it goes to the brain begins to think. Thinking is the activity of the brain, which is called the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex. That is where the thinking goes on. And that thinking gives meaning to what was seen or heard or smelled or tasted or touched. And because it gives meaning, according to the meaning that is given, there is an emotional reaction. The emotions react to the meaning that is given. You see, now if I say something and you interpret that, the meaning that you give to that is an insult. You are insulting me. Then what happens? You get angry. And getting angry means a message going from the brain to a gland, and the gland secreting a hormone into the blood, and the blood carries this to the whole body when the heart pumps. And then changes take place in the whole body. And so every emotion is a change in the whole body. The activity of the body is changed. That is what an emotion is. So it is a disturbance of the body. The body is disturbed, not just the mind. Mind is doing only the thinking. When you say mind, that now I told you there are words used by the Buddha, that thinking part is what is called mano. And the mano is what interprets what was seen or heard or smelled or tasted or touched. And according to the interpretation, you react emotionally. And when the emotion is aroused in this way, then it is expressed in action, in the form of speech or in the form of action, physical action. Now this is very important to remember always how these emotions come up. I told you that Sigmund Freud thought emotions are built into the system and it is going out from inside out. But here the Buddha points out that these emotions are not going inside out, it is coming from outside in. This is the important thing to understand. And this was discovered later by what are called the cognitive psychologists, who the word cognition is that interpretation or giving meaning. That thinking part is what is called cognition. And it is through that cognition that the emotion is aroused, according to the cognition. The thought that arises in the mind is creating the emotion. This is very important to understand. And this is why the Buddha pointed out that it is because people don't understand this that they are carried away by emotion. And by changing the way you think, changing the way you interpret your circumstances, you can get rid of the emotion. That is what the Buddha achieved. That is how he became a Buddha. How he awakened from the dream of existence. Now that existence is also very important. I told you we are dreaming that we are existing. How does that idea of existence come? From the emotions. This is the important thing to understand. And what is an emotion? Emotion is a reaction to a sensation. There are three kinds of sensations: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And that neutral sensation, what does that do? Pleasant sensation you are attracted to. The unpleasant sensation you are repelled by it. But the neutral sensation, what happens? You are not attracted or repelled, but you only think there is something there. There is something there. What is the meaning of is? Is means existence. That is what existence is all about. So these three things, the attraction to pleasure, the hatred of pain, and the idea of existence, that is what is called lobha, dosa and moha. Lobha refers to the attraction to the pleasant sensation, and dosa refers to the aversion towards the unpleasant sensation, and moha refers to the idea of existence. But when we say exist, it is only just something is existing. But the moment this reaction occurs, another thing happens. When the reaction occurs, the other thing is there is an object to which you react. That means there is an object and there is a reaction. The object is seen as something outside, external to you. And the subject or the subjective experience, which is the desire or the hatred, that is seen as something inside. So you create two things, a subjective and objective. The subjective you personalize. That means you say this is mine. The subjective is mine, the objective is something foreign, outside. You alienate the objective and personalize the subjective. Once you have personalized the subjective, the self comes into being. What you have personalized becomes yourself. So once you personalize, what is it that you call the self? You personalize the subjective, but what is that subjective thing? That subjective thing that you are personalizing is your body, your feelings, whatever you perceive, whatever you think about. You see, you are personalizing these subjective things, and that is what you call yourself. Now that personalizing, I am using this word personalizing, which you never read in the books. Why? That is how I translate the word upadana, which is normally translated as clinging or grasping. This is not clinging and grasping. This is personalizing. Now sometimes when you go to buy a pen, they might say, oh, we can personalize the pen. What does that mean? They write your name on it. So that means it says it belongs to you, this is mine. So to personalize is to say, this is mine. And what is mine becomes yourself. You see, supposing you go and buy a car. So maybe you have a BMW or something with expensive car. When you have that, you begin to feel proud. Why? Why is that? Simply because you have expensive car, why should you feel proud? Because you have personalized the car, and the car has become yourself. I am big because I have a car. Or you have a big house, you personalize the house, and then you become a big person because you have a big car, big house. You see? Or if you lose this car, what happens to you? Oh, you begin to feel inferior. Why? Because first you were superior, now you lost it. I feel inferior now. Why? Because that object has become yourself. And that object has now disappeared. You see, that personalizing whatever you personalize becomes yourself. That is what has happened. That is how the self comes into being, through personalizing. So, this is important to understand. How you become the self. So, in other words, this self is not a rational concept. It's an emotional concept. So, however much we reason out and we begin to see that there is no real self here, you can use reason and understand that there is no real self here. Then what happens? Till you begin to feel, yeah, there is no self, but I want this, I want that. How that? I has not disappeared. Although we have understood rationally there is no self, but still the feeling of self is there. So the self is a feeling, not a rational concept. This is why even if you have understood there is no real self, you still have the feeling of self. And therefore, the only way to get rid of that self is to get rid of the feelings, the emotions. You see? Now that is what is called Sakkaya Ditthi, which is becoming stream entrance. That means entering the stream. Now this we'll be discussing later. You don't have to worry too much about that. But the important thing is that the idea of self is not a rational thing. Because if we examine rationally, there cannot be existence or even a self. Why? Now, self is supposed to be something that exists. And what is existence? existence is a static concept in a dynamic reality. Existence is a static concept in a dynamic reality. Because everything is changing, every moment it is changing. But existence means it is not changing at all. Now when you are born, you see, you are just a baby. Now you grow up and become a young man or young woman. You are not a baby anymore. That means you have changed, completely changed. And then when you grow old and you die, that is another simplest, completely different thing. So from birth to death is a complete change going on. So that is a dynamic process. Existence itself, what we call existence, is a dynamic process. So how can it be existence? It is not existence. It is change. That is a process that is going on, changing. So existence is irrational. And it is emotional. So this is why we have to get rid of the emotions before we can get rid of the idea of self. And it is the idea of self that is creating all the problems. You know, Sigmund Freud thought all these problems are coming from the emotions. He didn't realize that these things are coming from the idea of self. This is a very interesting thing, but I don't want to go into this at this moment. Because this is really based on a very important psychological thing that the Buddha spoke of. You see, upadana was that personalizing. If you are interested in psychology, we can just mention that little. That Sigmund Freud spoke of the personality into three areas. The id, ego and the superego. Now the main thing is, he saw that the id really refers to the emotions. And the ego refers to what we call thinking process, intellect, or the thinking part. What the Buddha called mano and chitta. We discussed this last time. So, now the Buddha speak of 4 things you personalize. That means kama upadana, ditthi upadana, silabbata upadana, and attavada upadana. Now, kama upadana refers to the id, really, which is the emotional part. Calm there is the emotions. Ditti refers to the thinking part, views. And Attavada, not Attavada. Silabhata. Silabhata is really the superego, which is making you feel guilty when you do something. That is the conscience, which the Christians call the promptings of God. But Freud didn't see it as anything to do with God, but Freud saw it as something coming from childhood, where the mother and father will try to discipline the child. This is bad, this is good. Good and bad. The idea of good and bad is what disciplines you. That is your conscience. In your mind you think certain things are good, certain things are bad. So that is the Silabhata Upadana. And the fourth one, Attavada Upadana, the notion of self. You cling to the notion of self, or you personalize the notion of self. Now that part Freud didn't see. Freud saw only these three things. But the later Freudians began to take up this idea of self. And so they started talking about the self and the other. How you relate to yourself, the relationship between yourself and the others. So the later Freudians took up this. So their problem is mainly, they call it self, what is that?
Persuasion.
Assertiveness of the self. Now they see that mental problems are that they don't have self-assertiveness. And what they are trying to do as therapy is to help people to assert themselves. Self-assertion becomes important. And some of these psychologists, they have started Buddhist meditation. Now there is that psychologist called, what's that? Herbert Singh or some name like that. Now he and so many other psychologists have now tried to find out how they can relate this Buddhist idea of no-self and the psychological idea of self. They are always trying to strengthen the self. That is what the modern psychologists are trying to do. To strengthen the self, they practice self-assertion. But here, in Buddhism, we are talking about giving up the idea of self completely. So this has become a problem for them. Because according to their psychology, it is necessary to hold on to the idea of self. And in Buddhism, you have to give up the self. That is the problem that today most of these people, when they write books on Buddhist psychology, they have this problem which they can't solve. They don't know how to solve that. Because in Western thinking, I told you from the beginning, when Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, that idea they couldn't get rid of. Even present day philosophers are hung on that. I think, therefore I am. The thinking has become the self. In a way it is, because when we think, it is the thinking part, the cerebral activity, that is the thinking part. And that thinking part is what makes you conscious. Consciousness comes not from the perception, but from the cognition. That cognition is the thinking part, and that is the consciousness. You become conscious of a world outside. And that consciousness is only becoming conscious of something outside. But they don't know that consciousness is not aware of what is going on inside. How consciousness came into being? From where did this consciousness come into being? That they are not aware of. So that subjective part, they are not aware of. And so the modern psychologists, they thought science is advancing, but science is always focused on the object. When we talk about matter, it is the object. When we talk about energy, that is also object. And the psychologists like Sigmund Freud wanted to practice what is called introspection. That is looking at the inside, not the outside. Looking at the subjective, not the objective. So what happened was, they started criticizing Freud as not scientific. Why? Because he is practicing introspection. But that is the science that the Buddha taught. Introspective science, not extrospective science. The introspective science is what makes you understand how consciousness comes into being. So that is what Freud saw as the unconscious. That means we are not conscious of consciousness. Not being conscious of consciousness is the unconscious. But that unconsciousness can be discovered only through introspection. Introspection is what is called sati. Sati is what today people call mindfulness. Sati is not mindfulness, sati is introspection. Looking within, not looking outside. Today people, when they talk about mindfulness, mindfulness simply means to become aware of what is going on. This is not aware of what is going on outside, but this is aware of what is going on inside. And that is why it is introspection and not mindfulness. Understood, yeah? So, the important thing to understand is always these steps, what I call the chain reaction. That is the organism reacting to the stimulus. Environment is stimulating the senses and the organism is reacting. And that reaction is a chain reaction. First is perception, then comes cognition, then comes emotion, then comes action. Now that chain is what has to be stopped. That is the suffering or dukkha that the Buddha spoke of. That reaction is the suffering. But the real suffering is in the emotional part. It is the emotional part and the action part that is producing the suffering. So, what has to be done is to stop the emotion and the action. But to stop the emotion, we cannot start from the perception part. We have to start from the action part. So stopping the action part is the starting point. And that stopping the action part is what is called sila. So the behavior in the sila, first is sila, the next is to calm down the mind, which is in the emotions, must be got rid of, the emotional excitement. Now, for example, you become angry. Why you became angry? Why you became angry was how you interpreted your circumstance. You interpret what you saw or heard or smelled or tasted or touched. And according to the way you interpreted, the emotion was aroused. And because the emotion was aroused, it was expressed in speech or action. Now, the right thing to do is to stop that interpretation. But you cannot do that all at once. So the first thing is stop the action part. That is called sila. And the next step is to get rid of the emotional excitement. That is what is called Samadhi. Samadhi is getting rid of the emotional excitement. Then the third step is to change the way you interpret your circumstances. And that is panya. Panya. Sila, Samadhi, Panya. Yes. So the Panya is really changing the way you think. It's a transformation of the thinking process. So we have, when we talk about meditation, people talk about two kinds, samatha and vipassana. Samatha refers to that calming down the mind, freeing the mind of emotion. And vipassana refers to changing the way you think. Now you understood what sila is. Huh? Now when we think about sila, there is another important thing to understand. We are born self-centered. The small child that is born is always self-centered in the emotions. That means desire for pleasure and hatred of pain. These are self-centered. But that small child is not able to think properly. But as the child begins to grow up, the thinking part begins and the idea of self comes into being. And then you become selfish. I want this, I want that, and all that. So we are starting from a self-centered state. Now that self-centeredness gradually we begin to become aware of other people, mother, the father, the brothers, the sisters, and maybe other uncles, aunts, and all the relatives. And so we begin to understand that there are not only myself, there are other people also. And then your mind begins to expand outwards and you become, if you begin to understand the importance of other people, that say, if I pinch you, you will be hurt by that. Now if I recognize that, then I will not try to hurt you. So that means you are understanding other people's pain and pleasure, you see. You begin to understand that other people also don't like pain and other people also like pleasure. So you see, so you try to help other people and not harm other people. That means you are expanding your interest. Not only selfishness, you are also thinking of others. You are broadening your mind. That's the way to see. You are broadening your mind. And then you go beyond your family. Maybe you go to school and you think of the whole school. Or maybe you go further and think of the whole country. And that is what is called patriotism. But then you go beyond the country also and think of all the people in the world. But you may be thinking only of human beings, But then you begin to think of even the animals and even the plants. Environment, you begin to think of the environment. So, and you also begin to think of the whole universe. Maybe there are other beings in the universe. And so, this is why what is called the metta bhavana, metta meditation, is the friendliness towards all beings. And friendliness means you are thinking of the other person as important as yourself. That others are as important as yourself. So you are expanding or broadening your mind. And that broadening of the mind is what you do in beginning to control the mind. And as you begin to broaden your mind, you become more civilized. So in other words, beginning to behave in the proper way is also to become more and more civilized. So what we call civilization is simply where we broaden our mind to include others. So important to remember that what we are trying to do is to broaden the mind. And we will speak about the broadening further later. Today we can stop here.
What is the difference between Samadhi and Sati?
Samadhi and sati. Good. Samadhi is where we free the mind of emotional excitements so that the mind calms down. We keep the mind calm. That is the meaning of Samadhi. These people, the translators, translate Samadhi as concentration, which is completely wrong. Samadhi is not concentration. Samadhi is relaxation and tranquility of mind. That is what Samadhi is. And now the word sati. I already said sati is not mindfulness, sati is introspection. Turning the mind inwards. Your attention, sati really means attention. And satipatthana is really sati upatthana. Upa means inside, apa means outside. So upatthana means to place inside. Attention to be placed inside. That means introspection. That is what sati is.
What is the difference between Maitri and Karuna?
Difference between metta and karuna? Oh, that's a good question. Okay, now I have to keep explaining metta, karuna, mudita and upekkha. You see, this is the same state of mind, but in different aspects of the same state of mind. And that state of mind, now I spoke about broadening the mind. Now when the mind has been broadened, you are thinking of all beings, you are not thinking of yourself. That self-centeredness gradually disappears as